Welcome back to the fifth part of Influence and Intrigue, the role of women in the history of Israel. As you know, our focus tonight is on Ruth, one of two Old Testament women who have a whole book named after her. Esther, of course, is the other, and her story is actually much longer and more complicated. And yet the book of Ruth tells us more about her than probably any other single woman in the Old Testament. In fact, it's really too much for a single faith group's session. I mean, I've taught whole classes just on Ruth, and it is a marvelous example of great narrative artistry. Ironically, though, Ruth had the lowest status of any of the women in this study. She was a childless widow. She was destitute, reduced to gleaning just to stay alive. And she was a foreigner in Israel. I mean, hers is the least likely of all of these stories to be recalled and recorded. Now, to be honest, her story was told only once she managed to snag a very particular rich husband. But still, this really fits the theme of God using unlikely people to serve his will in surprising ways. Now, if you haven't yet read the whole book of Ruth or read it recently, I really encourage you to do so. It's a quick read, but a very engaging story. And because of that, I'm not going to try to rehearse the whole plot. Our focus instead will be on some key implications of the book. First, though, a couple of notes about the book and its writing, rather than Ruth herself. As you know, Christian Bibles place Ruth between Judges and 1 Samuel. And that's simply because of the opening line, in the days when the judges ruled. But the book itself admits that it was written much later. In chapter 4, verse 7, the author says, "Now this was the custom in former times in Israel." And clearly that was long enough ago that the author assumes his readers wouldn't know anything about it. And so Ruth has historical roots, but it's not an eyewitness report of events as they happened. In fact, Jewish Bibles don't put it in the same place. They include it in the group called the writings, kind of catch-all category that starts with the Psalms but has a whole variety of books in it. I think we can think of Ruth as historical fiction. That is, real events but told imaginatively. I have a book at home I got from my mother called The Autobiography of Henry VIII. Now, obviously, Henry was a real person, but he never wrote an autobiography. It's his story told imaginatively from his own point of view. So the kernel, the heart of Ruth, is historical, but the book is storytelling. And so we really want to follow the dynamics of the plot in order to listen for the message of the book. Now, in terms of Ruth herself, the first thing to note is that she was from Moab, not Israel. Moab was an entirely different nation, different ethnicity. They worshipped a false god named Chemosh. Plus, Moab was constantly a thorn in the side of Israel. The two nations were frequently at war. In fact, if you go back to Genesis 19, it tells a very unflattering origin story for Moab. I mean, clearly there was no love lost between the two countries. So for a Moabite woman to be the heroine of the story is shocking and disturbing. Many scholars suspect that the author of Ruth had some kind of polemic in mind. He was arguing for or against something. Problem is, the scholars can't agree on which side of which argument the author was on. But it's a remarkably positive portrait of a woman with hated foreign roots. A second dynamic in the story is how unpleasant and ungrateful Naomi is. I mean, she's the Israelite of these two main characters. She's the native of Bethlehem. She really ought to be the heroine of the story. And yet she is as cold toward Ruth as Ruth is loyal and supportive toward her. Now, to be sure, Naomi suffered tremendous loss. The death of her husband and both of her sons. She was a refugee at the time, was fleeing a famine. She had every reason to be bitter and unhappy and resentful. But one might think that would have made her more grateful for Ruth's loyalty and help. But instead, Naomi only warms up to Ruth once a husband is on the horizon. Now remember again how vital it was for ancient women to have children. Well, Naomi's two sons had both died. So she and her husband Elimelech, who had died long ago, had no heritage. And the belief at that time was, with no lineage, they would just disappear almost as if they had never lived. This is one reason that genealogies play such a prominent role in the Old Testament. Tracing lineage was critical to your whole sense of being. But Naomi could have children again through Ruth. It'd be a pretty convoluted relationship, to be sure, but as her daughter-in-law, if Ruth remarried, those would be Naomi's grandchildren. In any case, it's pretty amazing that the Israelite in the book is far less admirable than the Moabite. And a third feature of Ruth is the hidden presence of God in the story. Now, the Lord is really only mentioned in blessings, almost the way we say, God bless you, after someone sneezes. But the reader is meant to see God's hand guiding the whole story. I mean, for example, what inspired Ruth to show such extraordinary loyalty to Naomi? You know, Naomi had sent Orpah, the widow of her other son, back to Moab, and she went. But Ruth absolutely refused. And note here the gorgeous words of Ruth 1:16 and 17. Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. I mean, Ruth was willing to give up everything, her heritage, her religion, in order to stay with and support Naomi. Now, her words, many of you may recall, were once the basis of a wildly popular wedding song, Entreat me not to leave thee. But you know, that only works if you take the words out of context. Because Ruth 1:16 and 17 wasn't spoken between husband and wife, but from a daughter-in-law to a mother-in-law. And given all the jokes out there, you might suspect this is the warmest daughter-in-law-mother-in-law relationship that ever existed. Well, what could have inspired that, apart from the Spirit of God? Or again, how is it that Ruth just ended up gleaning in a field belonging to Boaz? He was rich, he was unmarried, and he was closely related to Naomi. It was like Ruth picked him out of a catalog. Plus, Boaz was instantly smitten with Ruth. So he wasn't especially hard for her to catch. In Ruth 2, her reputation preceded her. Boaz knew all about her before he met her, and he was impressed with what he had heard. And so it's almost humorous in that story the way he greased the skids for her to glean with a world record result. I mean, God gets no explicit credit for any of that. But he's clearly working behind the scenes to drive the story forward. But maybe the greatest sign of God's presence in Ruth is that the gambit for Ruth to win Boaz worked. You know, people who think the Bible is dull clearly haven't digested Ruth chapter 3. If this were a movie, chapter 3 would definitely be R-rated. Naomi sent Ruth basically to propose to Boaz in a bold, scandalous way. Naomi told her to bathe, which wasn't a daily experience at that time, wear her best dress, put on perfume, all the feminine charms. And then she sent Ruth to find Boaz at night, where he was sleeping to guard his pile of grain from any predators who would come to eat it. Not in broad daylight. And this all seriously pushed the envelope for an ancient woman. But that's nothing compared to Ruth 3, verses 4 through 9. But this takes a little bit of explanation. It's sort of ironic that the Old Testament unabashedly describes war and gore and immorality of every kind, but the writers were often really squeamish about our private parts. And so the Old Testament often substitutes the word feet as a euphemism for them. But of course, sometimes feet just mean feet. Only the context will tell you what the author intends. Well, Naomi told Ruth to uncover Boaz's feet and lie down. So was that so that his tootsies would get cold? Or was there something more daring going on? Well, Ruth 3:9 suggests that she didn't lie down by his toes. When Boaz awakes to find her there, Ruth says, "Spread your cloak or your wings over me," which means, take me into your marriage bed to be your wife. I mean, Ruth proposed, and she wasn't subtle about it. But then she told Boaz, "You are next of kin," or a redeemer, in order to urge him to honor a legal responsibility to have children for Naomi's sake, and especially Elimelech's sake. And this gets complicated, but the issue at work here is what was called the Levirate law. Again, for a man to die childless was thought to just erase his life. And so if that happened, his brother was to marry the dead brother's widow, his sister-in-law, and have children for the brother who has died. There was a similar duty to keep property in the clan to the nearest relative that you could. This was a great idea in theory, given the culture of that day, but in actual practice, it created lots of problems of its own. Well, in Ruth, this goes back to Naomi's two sons, who had both died. That meant that Elimelech had no descendants, and so Boaz had both a duty and an opportunity to have heirs for him. So Ruth said basically to Boaz, "Marry me and do your family duty for Elimelech." And Boaz, of course, required no convincing, and he went right to work the next day. But he did it in a clever way. In chapter 4, verses 3 and 4, he started with the land. Naomi still owned a plot of land from Elimelech. And there was a relative who was a little bit more closely related to Naomi than Boaz was. So he offers the land to this closer kinsman, who's happy to glom onto that, love to have more land. But then Boaz mentions the other duty under the Levirate law. Oh, did I forget to mention, if you buy the plot of land, a wife comes with it. You get to marry Ruth and have children for Elimelech. Well, in chapter 4, verse 6, the other kinsman instantly backs out of the deal. And he says, "This would create complications for my own heirs. I can't do that." And this was why the Levirate law was difficult to carry out. So Boaz just cleverly engineered the situation in order to secure Ruth. But we must not speed too quickly to the happily ever after here. I mean, it's really vital to recognize how risky this was for Ruth. Boaz could have rejected her, or he could have shamed her publicly for her risque actions. Others, if they learned about it, could have accused her of fornication or adultery, which was punishable by death. In fact, Boaz quickly saw the potential for scandal in what Ruth had done. Chapter 3, verse 14 says, "She lay at his feet until morning, but got up before one person could recognize another. For he, Boaz, had said, 'It must not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor.'" That can't get out in the community. I mean, that this whole thing didn't just blow up in Ruth's face testifies to God's involvement. Well, finally, it's vital not to skip the little genealogy that closes the book of Ruth. As we noted earlier, genealogies were crucially important in Israel. And in this case, assuring descendants for Elimelech really drives the whole story. But honestly, many of us find genealogies really boring or perplexing or just lists of names that don't mean anything to us. But in this case, the last name in the list jumps off the page. As it turned out, Ruth and Boaz were the great-grandparents of King David. Now, he too was a highly unlikely candidate chosen by God for great service. He ended up being the greatest king Israel ever had, even though no one would have pegged him for a king when he was born. Well, that tie to David is likely one big reason that Ruth was written and then preserved and then put in the canon of the Old Testament. But even so, stop to appreciate how extraordinary those decisions were. The greatest king of Israel had Moabite blood from his great-grandmother? I mean, given the importance of genealogies, how tempting would it have been to sanitize David's family tree to get rid of the foreigner? I mean, it's certainly not hard at all to imagine Israel's neighbors doing that. But not only to admit that Moabite element in David's heritage, but to write and canonize an entire book about it is very revealing. It reinforces that there are no human heroes in the Bible, only God. It demonstrates God's love for all people, not just Israel. God did choose Israel, but as a way to show the world who he was and what he was like. The Old Testament never suggests that God cared only for Israel. And it shows God's power to redeem and call and use all sorts of people. So in the end, Ruth is only secondarily an account of a remarkable, admirable woman. Through tragedy, intrigue, and clever scheming, it chiefly testifies to God, actively working to bless his people. And not only Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz, but all of Israel through King David. And as Christians, we can't miss the fact that Jesus is a direct descendant of David. And it just shows that God's perspective extends far beyond what we can hope or imagine. So now enjoy some great discussion around Ruth and her story in your small groups. And we'll see you next time.